The canvas tent stood alone in the clearing, its red cross painted hastily on the roof, flapping in the December wind. Inside, blood pooled on the frozen ground. 3 Wehrmacht soldiers pushed through the entrance, weapons raised, expecting resistance. They found none. What they discovered instead would shake their understanding of warfare itself. December 1944. The Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge had just begun, and German forces were pushing deep into American lines. Obergefreiter Klaus Hoffmann and his patrol had been advancing for 3 days straight, bypassing pockets of resistance, seizing supplies, and taking prisoners when they could. They were exhausted, hungry, and they'd been briefed that American field hospitals were gold mines. Morphine, plasma, surgical equipment that German forces desperately needed. But Hoffmann wasn't prepared for what he'd see inside that tent. The first thing that struck him wasn't the wounded Americans lying on stretchers. It wasn't even the sheer amount of medical supplies stacked against the canvas walls. It was the silence. In German field hospitals, you heard screaming. The kind that came from men whose wounds had gone gangrenous, whose limbs were being amputated without adequate anesthesia, whose infections spread like wildfire through understaffed, undersupplied aid stations. Here, the wounded men were quiet. Some were sleeping, others stared at the ceiling, their breathing steady despite visible injuries. Hoffmann lowered his rifle slightly. One of his men, a former medical orderly named Fischer, moved past him toward the supply crates. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps, or disbelief. Obergefreiter, Fischer whispered, "You need to see this." What Fischer had discovered would later be documented in Wehrmacht after-action reports, interrogation transcripts, and eventually in the personal diaries of German soldiers who survived the war. It would help explain one of World War II's most startling statistics. While German soldiers had a mortality rate from wounds of approximately 12 to 15%, American soldiers died from their wounds at a rate of just 4.5%. Less than half, less than a third in some theaters. The question that haunted German medical staff throughout the war wasn't just, how are they doing this? It was, why didn't we think of this first? Let me take you back to understand what made this discovery so revolutionary. By late 1944, Germany's medical infrastructure was collapsing. Not from lack of skill, German physicians and surgeons were among the world's finest. Not from lack of knowledge, German medical science had pioneered numerous surgical techniques. But from a fundamental failure in logistics and priority. German field medicine operated on a principle called conservation of force. Wounded soldiers were stabilized at the front, then transported, sometimes for days, to rear area hospitals where definitive surgery could be performed. The theory was sound. Keep the surgeon safe, keep the operating theaters clean, keep the skilled personnel away from the chaos of the front lines. The reality was catastrophic. A soldier shot through the abdomen at the front lines might not see a surgeon for 72 hours. Infection would set in within 12. By the time he reached an operating table, peritonitis had often spread too far to treat. The surgeon's skill didn't matter anymore. The man was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. German doctors knew this. They'd been reporting it up the chain of command since 1941. But the Wehrmacht's medical doctrine didn't change. Couldn't change, perhaps. The entire system, the placement of hospitals, the training of personnel, the allocation of resources, was built around the old model. Then there were the Americans. The U.S. Army Medical Corps had studied every war it could find records of. They'd pored over casualty reports from World War I, from the Spanish Civil War, from the early years of the current war. And they'd reached a radical conclusion. Speed matters more than safety. Treat the wound before infection sets in, even if that means putting surgeons in danger. Even if that means operating in tents within artillery range. Even if it seems insane. The American system was built on a principle that would later be called the Golden Hour. Though, in World War II, they were aiming for the Golden 6 hours. Get a wounded man from point of injury to a surgical table within 6 hours, and his chances of survival skyrocketed. But implementing that principle required a complete reimagining of combat medicine. Back in that tent in the Ardennes, Fisher was now pulling items from crates, examining them with the intensity of a man discovering artifacts from an alien civilization. Hoffman watched him, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "They have whole blood," Fisher said, his voice hollow. "Not just plasma, whole blood, in refrigerated units." Hoffman didn't immediately grasp the significance. Fisher explained it in broken sentences, his usual composure shattered. German field hospitals used plasma, the liquid component of blood without the red cells. It worked. It kept men alive. But whole blood was better. Dramatically better. It treated shock more effectively, carried oxygen, improved outcomes across every metric that mattered. Germany had the knowledge to collect and store whole blood. But the logistics? The refrigeration? The blood banks? The constant supply chain from donor to patient? The Americans had solved it. They'd created a network of blood banks stretching from the United States to every theater of war. They'd developed portable refrigeration units that could keep whole blood viable for weeks. They'd recruited hundreds of thousands of volunteer donors, processed millions of pints, and shipped it across oceans and continents to reach field hospitals like this one. Fisher kept pulling items from the crates. Penicillin. Bottles and bottles of it. Hoffman knew about penicillin. Every German soldier did. It was the miracle drug the Allies had, and Germany didn't. Oh, German chemists had tried to synthesize it. They'd failed. And even if they'd succeeded, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to mass produce it. The Americans were manufacturing penicillin by the ton. A wound that would kill a German soldier from sepsis in 5 days would heal cleanly in an American with penicillin treatment. Pneumonia, the killer of wounded men in every war in history, could be knocked out in 72 hours with the drug. Fisher found sulfa drugs, bandages infused with antiseptics, morphine syrettes, pre-loaded, pre-measured doses that any soldier could administer. In German forces, morphine came in vials that required preparation, measurement, injection under battlefield conditions. Americans had turned pain relief into a foolproof system. Then Fisher found the surgical instruments. "They're disposable," he said, holding up a sealed packet containing a complete surgical kit. "Single use. They use them once and throw them away." The concept was so foreign to German medical doctrine that Hoffman initially thought Fisher had misunderstood. In the Wehrmacht, surgical instruments were precious. They were cleaned, sterilized, reused hundreds of times. They were transported carefully, maintained meticulously. Losing a set of surgical instruments could cripple a field hospital's effectiveness. The Americans manufactured them so cheaply, in such vast quantities, that they could use them once and discard them. No risk of incomplete sterilization. No cross-contamination between patients. Just open a new kit for each surgery. But the real revelation came when Fisher examined the organizational structure of the aid station itself. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a detailed chart on the tent wall. It showed the entire American medical evacuation chain, from front-line medics to field hospitals to evacuation hospitals to general hospitals in the rear. The system had 5 levels. Level 1, the battalion aid station, just behind the front lines. Basic stabilization, stop the bleeding, treat the shock, apply sulfa powder, inject morphine, Attach a tag documenting time of injury and treatment given. Get the man moving. Level 2. The clearing station. More comprehensive treatment. Plasma or whole blood. Reassessment. Triage. Send the less severe cases to holding areas. Send the critical cases forward immediately. Level 3. The field hospital. This was where Hoffman stood now. Full surgical capabilities. Operating rooms in tents, surgeons working in shifts 24 hours a day. Patients were operated on, stabilized, and moved out within 24 to 48 hours. The tent never got full because patients never stayed long. Level 4. Evacuation hospitals further back. More complex surgeries. Longer-term care. Plastic surgery for facial wounds. Orthopedic surgery for complex fractures. Level 5. General hospitals in rear areas or back in the United States. Rehabilitation. Long-term recovery. The entire system was designed around one principle: keep the patient moving. Each level did its job and passed the patient along. No bottlenecks. No overwhelmed hospitals holding patients for weeks. The frontline medic had one job: stabilize and evacuate. The field surgeon had one job: operate and evacuate. The system flowed. Fisher traced his finger along the chart, doing mental calculations. From injury to surgery, they're averaging 4 hours. 4 hours, Hoffman. In German forces, 4 days was good, but even that wasn't the full picture. Hoffman noticed something else. The Americans had dedicated personnel for evacuation. They didn't pull infantrymen from the line to carry stretchers. They had trained litter bearers. They had ambulance companies, whole units whose sole purpose was to move wounded men from point A to point B as rapidly as possible. They had jeeps converted into ambulances. They had trucks with suspension systems designed to minimize jostling of wounded patients. They had helicopters. Hoffman had heard about those, though he'd never seen one. That could evacuate a critical patient from a forward position directly to a surgical hospital in minutes. The resources America had thrown at this problem were staggering. Fisher found the tent's inventory log. He read through it, his lips moving silently, then looked up at Hoffman. This one station, just this one station, has more medical supplies than our entire division. Hoffman wanted to dispute that. Surely it was an exaggeration. But Fisher kept reading off numbers: gallons of plasma, thousands of sulfa packets, hundreds of surgical kits, enough morphine to keep a regiment supplied for a month, antibiotics, antiseptics, anesthetics, splints, casts, bandages in types and quantities Fisher couldn't even identify. And this was one field hospital. The Americans had dozens of them in this sector alone, hundreds across all theaters. One of the wounded Americans was stirring. Hoffman approached him carefully. The man was young, maybe 20, with a bandaged chest wound. His eyes focused on Hoffman's uniform, and fear flickered across his face, but he didn't cry out. "We feel?" Hoffman found himself asking in broken English. "How many hours?" The American soldier didn't understand at first. Hoffman tried again, gesturing to the bandage. "When shot?" "This morning," the American replied, his voice weak but steady. "Maybe 7 hours ago?" 7 hours from injury to surgical field hospital, and the man had already been operated on. The surgical tags attached to his stretcher documented it. Shrapnel removed from chest cavity. Wound cleaned. Antibiotics administered. Prognosis, good. In 7 hours, this American soldier had received better medical care than most German soldiers would receive in 7 days. Hoffman felt something shift inside him. He'd been told that American soldiers were soft, coddled, lacking in the hardness that defined the German fighting man. Now he understood. The Americans didn't need to be hard. Their system made them resilient. A German soldier knew that a serious wound was likely a death sentence. An American soldier knew he had better than a 95% chance of survival if he could just hold on until the medics reached him. That changed how men fought, how they took risks, how they supported each other. A German soldier might hesitate before running into fire to drag a wounded comrade to safety, not from cowardice, but from the knowledge that the wounded man would likely die anyway. And now there would be 2 casualties instead of 1. An American soldier knew that if he could get his buddy to a medic, that man would probably survive, would probably be back with the unit in weeks or months. The incentive to take that risk was exponentially higher. Fisher was now examining the training manuals he'd found. Each American medic carried one, waterproofed, pocket-sized, comprehensive. It covered every common battlefield injury with clear, step-by-step instructions, drawings, diagrams. No medical degree required, just follow the manual. "They've made it idiot-proof," Fisher said, and there was admiration in his voice despite himself. Any soldier with basic training can provide effective first aid. Their medics are trained to the level of our physician's assistants. They're field surgeons. He trailed off, flipping through a surgical manual. Their field surgeons are performing procedures in tents that we only attempt in rear-area hospitals with full equipment. The sound of artillery rumbled in the distance. American artillery, Hoffman realized. The counterattack was beginning. His patrol needed to move. But first, Fisher did something that Hoffman would remember for the rest of his life. The medic pulled out a notebook and began frantically copying information from the American manuals. Treatment protocols, drug dosages, surgical techniques, anything he could capture in the minutes they had remaining. "We have to tell them," Fisher muttered as he wrote. "Someone has to tell them. This is how you save lives. This is what we should have been doing all along." Hoffman knew that "them" meant German high command. He also knew that Fisher's notes would never change anything. The system was too entrenched, the resources too depleted. Germany couldn't replicate this, even if they wanted to. The industrial capacity, the supply chains, the sheer wealth required to put whole blood and penicillin and disposable surgical kits into every field hospital. Germany simply didn't have it anymore, if they'd ever had it at all. The patrol withdrew from the tent 15 minutes later. They took some morphine, some bandages, supplies they desperately needed. But they left most of it intact. What would have been a catastrophic loss for a German medical unit barely dented the American supplies. As they moved back through the forest, Hoffman glanced back at the tent with its painted red cross. He thought about the wounded American soldier already recovering, who would likely be home in a few months. He thought about the German soldiers in field hospitals kilometers behind the lines, dying from wounds that the Americans would consider routine. The Battle of the Bulge would ultimately fail. The Wehrmacht's last great offensive would collapse within weeks. Historians would cite many reasons: Allied air superiority, fuel shortages, overextended supply lines, the arrival of Patton's Third Army. But in that moment, Hoffman understood a deeper truth. Germany hadn't just been outfought. They'd been outsupported. The American way of war wasn't about producing tougher soldiers. It was about producing a system that didn't waste soldiers, that valued each individual life enough to build an entire infrastructure around saving it. German military philosophy emphasized will, spirit, the strength to endure suffering. The Americans had taken a different path. They'd decided that no soldier should have to endure preventable suffering. If a wound could be treated, treat it. If a life could be saved, save it, and build whatever system necessary to make that possible. After the war, captured Wehrmacht medical officers were extensively debriefed by Allied intelligence. Their testimony was unanimous. The American medical system was the most significant factor in the disparity in casualty mortality rates. Not the penicillin alone, though that mattered. Not the whole blood alone, though that saved thousands. But the entire integrated system, from the training of frontline medics, to the helicopter evacuations, to the specialized hospitals, to the rehabilitation centers back home. The Americans had industrialized medicine the same way they'd industrialized everything else. They'd applied mass production, standardization, quality control, and logistics to the problem of battlefield trauma. And it worked. Fisher's notes survived the war. They're preserved in a German military archive. 30 pages of cramped handwriting documenting his desperate attempt to capture the essence of what he'd seen. At the bottom of the last page, he'd written a single sentence that summarized everything. They treat their soldiers like they're worth saving. In the German system, soldiers were resources to be expended. In the American system, soldiers were investments to be protected. The difference in philosophy manifested in every aspect of combat medicine, and the results were undeniable. By war's end, of the American soldiers wounded in action who received medical treatment, more than 95% survived. It remains one of the highest survival rates in military history, not surpassed until the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, when the golden hour became the golden 60 minutes, and battlefield medicine reached new levels of sophistication. But the foundation was laid in World War II, in tents with Red Crosses, in the hands of medics who carried waterproof manuals and preloaded morphine syrettes, in the minds of doctors who understood that proximity to the front line was worth the risk, in the logistics of a nation that could ship whole blood across an ocean and deliver it fresh to a field hospital in the Ardennes. Klaus Hoffmann survived the Battle of the Bulge. He was wounded in January 1945 during the German retreat. He spent 3 days in a Wehrmacht field hospital before being transported to a rear area facility. Gangrene had set into his leg wound by then. The limb was amputated. He recovered, but he spent the rest of his life walking with a cane. Decades later, in an interview with a German historian, Hoffmann was asked what he remembered most vividly from the war. He didn't speak of battles. He didn't describe his wound or the amputation. Instead, he described the American medical tent. "I saw the future," he said, "and I understood why we lost. It wasn't about tanks or aircraft or atomic bombs. It was about a nation that could afford to care whether its soldiers lived or died. And that chose to care. That built a system around that care. That valued human life enough to revolutionize medicine itself. The tent in the Ardennes was just one small piece of that system. But in its stocked crates and surgical tools and sleeping wounded, it represented something profound. The idea that soldiers aren't merely weapons to be wielded, but human beings worth extraordinary effort to preserve. That was the lesson written in whole blood and penicillin. That was what the Wehrmacht soldiers discovered when they captured that American medical tent. And that was why so few GIs died from wounds.